He said he was paid to do it. But when the money trail was finally exposed, it led to a name even darker than his own. Sunday morning. Brentwood. A neighborhood so quiet, so pristine, even the birds seemed to sing in designer key. But by noon, the street was blocked off with yellow tape. Cameras swarmed like flies around honey. Sirens wailed. A man was in cuffs. A woman was sobbing on the front lawn. 2 bodies were being zipped into black bags and wheeled out of a home worth $13.5 million. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And Hollywood? Hollywood was stunned. Rob Reiner, the legendary actor, director, activist, dead. His wife, Michelle, producer, philanthropist, mother, also gone. Brutally stabbed to death in their own estate. The suspect? Their own son, Nick Reiner, 32, found barefoot, blood-soaked, and barely blinking in the guest house. And when the cops asked him what happened, he whispered something that chilled even the most seasoned detective. "I was paid to do this." Wait, what? What do you mean paid? That's the question every news anchor, every neighbor, every fan of Rob Reiner's films is now asking. But here's the thing. This isn't just a tragic Hollywood murder. This is a slow-burning family collapse decades in the making. A story laced with secrets, addictions, betrayals, and yes, money. Lots and lots of money. And if you think the arrest is where the story ends, think again. Because as investigators dug into Nick Reiner's past, into his bank accounts, into his therapy sessions, into his screenplays, what they found flipped the entire case on its head. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind. Let's go back to where it all started. A family built on fame, drowning in silence. Because the story you're about to hear, it doesn't just reveal the truth about Nick Reiner's shocking confession. It tears down the entire illusion of what we thought the Reiner family was. And when the final twist drops, you'll be asking the same thing we did. Was this murder orchestrated from the outside or from deep within? Let's pause here. Because in a case this explosive, the small details matter. So before we jump to the who and the why, let's focus on the when and the how. The very moment everything shattered. It was around 9:14 a.m. when a call came in from the Reiner residence. A young woman, voice trembling. She didn't even say her name at first. Just, "They're not breathing. There's blood, so much blood." That woman was Romy Reiner, Rob and Michelle's only daughter. 27 years old. An artist, a writer, a loving sister, but one who, according to close friends, had grown increasingly worried about the mental state of her older brother. She had driven to the house that morning to meet her parents for brunch. But what she walked into was a waking nightmare. The front door was ajar. The hallway rug was soaked. There was a faint metallic smell in the air. And in the kitchen, where Sunday pancakes were supposed to be warming, she saw them. Her mother and father. On the floor. Side by side. Gone. The knife, later confirmed as the murder weapon, was found still lodged in a floorboard. Police arrived within minutes. And then, they checked the guest house. Inside, Nick was sitting on the bed. Still. Distant. Shirt off. Palms up, as if he'd been waiting. When they asked him what happened, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just said, "I was paid to do this." Now pause again. You've probably heard that quote a dozen times already on the news. But let's really sit with it. Because that line, 6 words, is not just a confession. It's a code, a trigger, a mystery. Who paid him? Why? What could possibly justify killing the very people who gave you life? Let's not forget, Rob Reiner wasn't just any father. He was Rob Reiner. Meathead from All in the Family. The genius behind Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men. A man beloved by millions, respected across political aisles, feared by no one. Until now. Michelle, his wife, was the glue of the family. Private, elegant, a fierce advocate for mental health, especially after years of helping Nick through addiction and recovery. So how does a family that's been through that much end like this? That's what this expose is about. Because what you're about to learn isn't on TMZ. It's not in the glossy magazine tributes. It's buried in court documents, therapy notes, old voicemails, unreleased memoir pages, and one very strange video file found on Nick's laptop, labeled offer_accepted.mov. Yes, that exists, and we're going to get to it. But first, Let's talk about why this story matters now. Because here's the truth. We're living in an age of headlines, where stories flash by at lightning speed. One day it's a celebrity death. Next day it's a trial. Next day it's all forgotten. But this one sticks. Why? Because it's about family. About what happens when love turns into fear. When secrets rot from the inside out. When children grow up under a spotlight, and shadows grow longer than legacies. And most chilling of all, it's about how sometimes the person you're most afraid of is the one with your last name. Let's pull the lens back just a bit. At the time of the murder, Nick Reiner had been living in the guest house for over 18 months. He was said to be sober, writing again, even attending family dinners. But behind closed doors, there were signs. Neighbors heard yelling late at night. Grocery deliveries included unusual items: 10 pounds of raw meat, 2 packs of surgical gloves, and a children's music box. Strange? Yes. Coincidence? Maybe. Until you realize what the music box played. A lullaby called "Go to Sleep, Little Boy." A tune Rob used to sing to Nick as a toddler. Yeah, creepy just became chilling. Here's what we know. The week before the murders, Michelle made several frantic phone calls. To her sister, to a private investigator, and to someone whose number was redacted in the official police report. She told them, "I think Nick's slipping. He's saying things that don't make sense. I found a list in his room, and my name was on it." The list? Still missing. The redacted number? Still a mystery. And the final call she ever made was to Romy. She said, "Please come early Sunday. I don't want to be alone with him anymore." So here's where we're going. This expose isn't just about what happened. It's about why it happened now. It's about who may have been pulling the strings behind the scenes. And it's about the secrets the Reiner family took to the grave, some of which are still unraveling in real time. From Nick's chilling journal entries to a potential paternity twist that may rewrite everything, to whispers of a powerful figure in Hollywood who had more to gain from Rob Reiner's silence than from his survival. We're diving deep, chapter by chapter, twist by twist, with every revelation more disturbing than the last. And by the time we reach the final chapter, you won't just be asking, "Why did Nick Reiner do this?" You'll be asking, how many more are out there just waiting to be paid? Because what happens next? What happens in the guest house? What happens in the trial? What happens with the people who paid Nick Reiner? That's where the story really begins. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Unless you knew what to look for, the guest house looked perfectly ordinary. Tucked behind the main estate, just past a row of perfectly trimmed hedges and a vine-covered pergola, the Reiners' guest house had once been a peaceful place. A creative space. A retreat. Years ago, it was where Rob hosted visiting writers. A studio. A sanctuary. But now, it was a crime scene. A vault of secrets. A pressure cooker that finally blew. So here's the question. How does a quiet cottage become the epicenter of a double homicide? Let's go inside. And trust me, you'll want to pay attention to the small details. Because that's where the horror lives. The door wasn't locked. That's the first thing the detectives noticed. The second? The smell. Not blood. Not yet. That would come later. What hit them first was something faint, sweet, and out of place. Lavender and bleach. The scent of cleaning chemicals barely masking something deeper, something rotten. Like someone had tried to erase something, but didn't finish the job. The living room was sparse. Too sparse. No family photos. No personal mementos. Just a couch, a table, and, bizarrely, a tripod-mounted camera pointed directly at the center of the room. The red light on the camera? Still blinking. Recording. Now here's where things get weird. On the table beneath the camera was a half-filled journal. The kind therapists recommend, leather-bound, spiral spine, thick pages. On the cover? Rebirth. Not Nick. Not journal. Just one word. Rebirth. Inside were scribbles. Doodles. Pages torn out violently. But one page remained, circled in heavy red ink. It read, "When the director becomes the target, the script flips. I was chosen for a reason. Cast and paid. Blood is a contract." Hold up. Let's read that again. Cast and paid. Blood is a contract. Are we talking metaphor or motive? Because investigators weren't sure either. Let's talk about that camera. Forensics recovered 3 recordings. 2 were silent. Blurry. Mostly Nick pacing. But the third? The third began at 4:17 a.m., just hours before the murders. It showed Nick seated, shirtless, rambling into the lens. He looked vacant. His eyes weren't focused on the camera, but somewhere beyond it. And what he said wasn't just disturbing. It was scripted, word for word, line for line, matching an old screenplay Nick wrote back in rehab, one he titled House of Glass. In that script, the son of a Hollywood producer murders his parents after believing they're imposters. Let that sink in. Now you might be wondering, was this just art imitating life? Or life imitating a script? Either way, one thing was clear. Nick Reiner had been living in a world where fantasy and reality were blurring, and no one stopped it. But that wasn't all they found in the guest house. Let's talk about the walls. Because behind one of them, the one nearest the bed, was something investigators didn't expect. A hollow panel. Inside, a shoebox, labeled Press Play if dead. No, I'm not making that up. Inside the box was a USB drive, a photograph, and a child's drawing, crayon on paper, dated 1997. The drawing showed 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman with glasses, and a small child between them. But there was a fourth figure, dark, oversized, looming in the corner with scribbled red eyes. The word written beside it, him, just him, no other name. No one in the family could explain it. Romy hadn't seen it before. Neither had any of Nick's former therapists. So who was him? We'll get to that. But first, let's hit pause on the visual clues and talk about behavior. According to the Reiner's housekeeper, who'd been with them for over a decade, Nick had recently become different, more withdrawn, more paranoid, and more methodical. He started covering windows with blackout curtains, kept a knife under his pillow, started referring to the main house as the stage. Quote, "They only come to perform, never to connect, never to love, just to rehearse their lies." Creepy? Sure. But here's where it gets chilling. He wrote that on the back of every grocery list he gave the housekeeper. And one day, he asked her to pick up a specific item. An empty notebook. No lines. Only blank pages. "It's time to write my truth." Guess what notebook that was? Yep. Rebirth. Let's step back again. You're probably asking, where were Rob and Michelle in all this? How could they live just yards away and not see the warning signs? The truth? They did see them. In fact, Michelle had written multiple emails to a private therapist asking for emergency sessions. In one, dated just 10 days before the murders, she wrote, "I feel like we're living next to a ticking time bomb. He's saying things about being watched, about assignments. I don't know if he's spiraling or being manipulated." Being manipulated. That phrase would come up again, and again, and again, because as it turns out, Nick wasn't just spiraling. He may have been following instructions. From who? That's what the FBI wanted to know when they seized his laptop. We'll explore that digital rabbit hole later. For now, let's finish the tour. Back to the guest house. The bathroom revealed another strange clue. The mirror had been smashed, not shattered, removed piece by piece, placed carefully into a garbage bag, tied, and hidden under the sink. Why? Nick had taped a note inside the medicine cabinet. It read, "Reflections lie. Cameras do not. I am real. They are not." Whatever that means, it wasn't just poetry. It was a philosophy. Nick had stopped seeing his parents as parents. He saw them as actors, imposters, projections, which makes what happened next all the more horrifying. Because just outside the guest house, they found scratch marks, not animal, human, down the side of the interior doorframe, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. But Nick wasn't the one scratching. Fingerprints matched an unknown party. DNA inconclusive. One possibility? Someone else had been inside that guest house recently. Someone not listed on the property records. Someone who might have been there the night of the murders. Now ask yourself, if Nick was paid to do it, was this someone the one who paid him? Before we wrap this chapter, let's zoom out. This guest house wasn't just a room. It was a character, a container, a diary. And if walls could talk, they'd whisper things no one was ready to hear. Because this wasn't the first time police were called to the estate. Years ago, in 2016, there was an anonymous 911 call placed from the same guest house. The call was traced to a burner phone. The complaint? He's screaming again. Something about scripts and blood. No one followed up. No charges were filed. Rob and Michelle insisted it was a creative outburst. Hollywood logic. Tragedy delayed. So where does that leave us? With a guest house that was more than a dwelling. It was a trigger, a cage, a confession booth. It held secrets Nick Reiner couldn't say out loud, until he finally did. Until he said, I was paid to do this. But what he didn't say? By who? That's where we go next. Because the next chapter takes us into the heart of the storm. The man behind the madness. The boy who broke. The son who wasn't supposed to survive long enough to confess. Nick Reiner. Who he was. Who he became. And who, or what, broke him. And when you learn what his childhood was really like, you might start to wonder if this tragedy was ever avoidable at all. Who was Nick Reiner before the headlines turned him into a monster? Before the mugshot? Before the blood-soaked guest house? Before 6 words detonated a family legacy? Here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. Was Nick Reiner born broken? Or built that way? Because when you strip away the crime tape and the screaming headlines, what you find underneath isn't a cartoon villain. It's a boy raised in the glow of Hollywood lights and the shadow they cast. Nick Reiner was born into a life most people only dream about. Private schools, summer homes, dinner conversations with directors, actors, activists. A father whose voice echoed through American living rooms. A mother who believed fiercely in healing, empathy, and second chances. From the outside, perfect. From the inside, crushing. Friends from Nick's childhood remember him as quiet, observant, always listening, rarely speaking. The kind of kid who sat at the edge of the room, absorbing everything, storing it away. And storing it away is important. Because Nick didn't explode early. He imploded slowly. Let's talk about Rob Reiner for a moment. Not the public figure, but the father. Rob was present, loving, supportive, but he was also busy, famous, demanding, even when he didn't mean to be. Nick once told a college friend, my dad could command a room without trying. When he walked in, everyone listened. When I spoke, no one noticed. That sentence should stop you cold, because it reveals something subtle but dangerous. Nick didn't feel seen. Not as Nick. Not as himself. Only as Rob Reiner's son. And in Hollywood, that label is both a privilege and a curse. Nick tried to follow in his father's footsteps. Writing, directing, storytelling. But every script he turned in was compared. Every pitch was weighed against a legend. And every rejection felt personal. He bounced between film schools. Dropped out. Re-enrolled. Dropped out again. His peers moved on. He stayed stuck. That's when the drugs entered the picture. At first, it was recreational. Social. Then it became medicinal. A way to quiet the noise. Prescription pills. Then cocaine. Then heroin. Each time he spiraled, Michelle stepped in. Rehab. Therapy. Clean slates. She believed in redemption. Rob believed in discipline. And Nick? Nick believed he was failing both of them. By his mid-20s, Nick had already been to rehab 3 times. Each stint ended the same way. Hope. Promises. Relapse. But here's the contradiction no one talks about. Nick wasn't lazy. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't careless. He was obsessive. When he wrote for hours without stopping. When he focused, he hyper-focused. When something got into his head, it stayed there. Therapists flagged it early. Obsessive thought loops. Dissociation. A tendency to blur metaphor and reality. One psychiatrist wrote in his notes, Nick intellectualizes emotion to avoid feeling it. When overwhelmed, he retreats into narratives. Narratives. Stories. Scripts. That word is going to matter a lot. After his 3rd rehab stint, Nick wrote what would later become an eerie foreshadowing of everything to come. A short screenplay titled House of Glass. The premise? A famous filmmaker and his wife begin to suspect their adult son believes they are imposters. The son becomes convinced the family is a performance, staged for someone watching. The ending? The son ends the play to expose the truth. At the time, therapists called it cathartic. Looking back, it reads like a confession waiting for a trigger. But let's not rush. Because after rehab number 4, something changed. Nick came back, calmer, quieter, too quiet. Friends noticed he stopped venting, stopped complaining, stopped asking for help. Instead, he started saying things like, I've been chosen for something important. This all makes sense now. There's a structure to the chaos. That's not recovery talk. That's belief talk. And belief, when it hardens, becomes dangerous. Here's where the guest house becomes relevant again. Rob and Michelle, didn't just let Nick move in for convenience. They did it out of fear. Fear he would relapse. Fear he would disappear. Fear he would hurt himself. Living on the property felt safer. What they didn't realize. It also gave Nick space to isolate and incubate. Alone, unsupervised, surrounded by his thoughts, and someone else. Because this is where the story takes a sharp turn. Nick wasn't as alone as everyone thought. Phone records later revealed Nick had been in near-daily contact with an unknown number for months. Not a dealer, not a therapist, not family. The calls were short, never more than 2 minutes. Always late at night. When investigators tried to trace the number, burner phone. Unregistered. But Nick had saved it under a name. Just one word. Producer. Think about that. Not friend. Not mentor. Not help. Producer. A role. A title. A function. Someone who, in Nick's mind, wasn't part of his life, but part of a project. People who interacted with Nick during this period described something unsettling. He spoke in terms of acts and scenes, referred to conversations as takes, called emotional reactions good performances. One friend recalled Nick saying, "If you do it right, they won't even know it's happening." At the time, they laughed it off. Now, it sounds like rehearsal. Let's talk about Romy for a moment. Romy adored her brother growing up. She defended him, covered for him, fought with her parents when they tried tough love. But in the final year, she pulled away. Why? Because Nick started talking to her differently. Not like a brother, like an observer. He asked strange questions. If someone played a role their whole life, does that make them real? Would you stop someone if you thought they were part of a lie? Do you think mom and dad ever wanted different children? Those aren't casual questions. Those are tests. And Romy felt it. She later told a close friend. It felt like he was measuring us. Like he'd already decided something and was waiting for us to confirm it. Confirm what? That they weren't real? That they deserved what was coming? Or that someone else was pulling the strings? Here's another disturbing detail. Nick started receiving money. Not from his parents. Not from work. Wire transfers. Cash deposits. Small at first. Then larger. Always labeled as consulting. Consulting on what? No one knew. Until detectives matched the deposit dates with changes in Nick's behavior. Each payment coincided with a shift. A new idea. A new fixation. A new sense of urgency. And the final transfer? Arrived 3 days before the murders. Enough to pay off his debts. Enough to disappear. Enough to do something irreversible. Now ask yourself, if Nick was just a disturbed addict, why pay him at all? Why not manipulate him emotionally? Why not push him quietly? Why money? Unless the act itself was transactional. Unless someone wanted deniability. Unless Nick wasn't just a son, but a tool. This is where public sympathy fractures. Because here's the hard truth. Nick Reiner wasn't completely out of control. He planned. He prepared. He documented. He wasn't acting in a blind rage. He was following a script. But whose script? That's the question investigators kept circling back to. And every path led away from Nick, toward someone else. Before the murders, Nick wrote one final note in his journal. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. I know this will hurt them. That's not the goal. The goal is exposure. Once the truth is visible, the pain ends. I've been compensated. I understand the terms. Compensated. Terms. That's not madness. That's a contract. So who is Nick Reiner? A broken son? A failed artist? A manipulated pawn? Or something far more unsettling? A willing participant who believed the story he was sold and decided the ending was worth the cost? Because in the next chapter, we're going to step back into the house. Not the guest house. The main house. The place where Rob and Michelle spent their final moments. The place where the crime scene tells a story Nick never could. And when you see what was staged and what wasn't, you'll realize this wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a message, and it was meant for someone very specific. But what the investigators found on the kitchen floor would raise one terrifying question. Was this murder meant to be discovered exactly the way it was? But what the investigators found on the kitchen floor would raise one terrifying question. Was this murder meant to be discovered exactly the way it was? Sunday, 9:14 a.m. Romy Reiner's voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher. She didn't use her last name, didn't give an address, just 7 words. My parents, they're not breathing. There's blood. Then silence. No crying. No screaming. Just a gasp. Then the click of the line going dead. When officers arrived at the Brentwood estate, it was quiet. Too quiet. One neighbor later said. It was like the house had been holding its breath. And when the officers stepped into the foyer, they realized something immediately. They hadn't just walked into a crime scene. They had walked into a stage. Because nothing about what they saw felt spontaneous. This looked arranged. Let's break it down. The front door was slightly ajar, though there were no signs of forced entry. The alarm system? Off. The kitchen? Pristine, aside from the blood. But the blood wasn't splattered wildly. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, lined, controlled. Two trails, almost parallel, leading to where Rob and Michelle's bodies were found. Side by side, facing upward, hands clasped. Let that settle for a moment. Who arranges the bodies of people they just murdered to look peaceful? Unless that's part of the message. Unless someone wanted them found that way. The medical examiner would later say the positioning of the bodies post-mortem was unlikely to be the result of panic, rage, or impulsive action. In other words, this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing. This was methodical, cold, calculated, symbolic. But symbolic of what? Let's talk about the kitchen table. There were 2 plates. Fresh fruit, toast, coffee still warm. 1 cup tipped slightly, lipstick on the rim. Another untouched. It looked like breakfast had just begun. Except, there were no utensils, no napkins, just a yellow envelope, placed squarely between the plates. No name, no address, no handwriting. Inside, a single black and white photo. Nick, age 6, sitting between Rob and Michelle. Everyone smiling, but there's something off. Something you don't notice at first, until you really look. Nick's hands? They're clenched into fists. His eyes? Not at the camera. At his father. And the image, for reasons no one understands, had been torn down the middle and taped back together. That tape? A match to the same brand found in Nick's guest house drawer. Now pause. You might think, so what? A creepy photo at a crime scene. Not exactly groundbreaking. But it wasn't the photo that broke the detectives. It was what was written on the back. 7 words. All caps. Red ink. We finally took a family picture. Yeah, let that sink in. Officers began searching the house room by room. No signs of forced entry. No windows broken. No valuables stolen. Not a robbery. Not random. This was targeted. Intimate. Personal. There was no struggle. No defensive wounds. Rob and Michelle had been stabbed, but not frantically. With precision. Both had deep, clean wounds to the chest. Almost identical in angle and depth. Experts said it was the kind of consistency you'd expect from a medical professional, or someone following instructions. So, naturally, the question rose. Was Nick alone that night, or was he following someone's plan? In the hallway outside the kitchen, investigators found something else. A sticky note. Just 1 word. Action. Underlined 3 times. Next to it, a floor lamp, knocked over on purpose. Why does that matter? Because according to the Reiner's housekeeper, who arrived later that day and was briefly held for questioning, that sticky note hadn't been there the day before. She remembered dusting that exact table. There was no note, which means someone placed it there between Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning, deliberately, after the fact, like they were marking the scene, like it was the beginning of something. Let's go back to Romy for a second. She was the one who discovered the bodies. But her story? It adds another chilling layer. She told police, "The minute I opened the door, it felt wrong. Like the air was thick. Like I wasn't supposed to be there." And when she walked into the kitchen, she didn't scream. She froze. Because according to Romy, something about the way her parents were positioned reminded her of an old dream. A recurring nightmare she'd had as a child. In it, her mother and father were lying side by side in a field, holding hands. Their eyes open, but lifeless. She said, "I hadn't thought about that dream in years. But when I saw them, I knew. This wasn't just murder. This was a message. To who? Maybe to her. Maybe to Rob and Michelle. Maybe to the world. But that message was only beginning to unfold. Let's talk about the phone call. When police checked the house phone logs, they discovered something strange. At 3:28 a.m., a call was placed from the house landline to the guest house. Duration, 11 seconds. No one answered. It was never picked up. But here's the kicker. Nick told police he never heard the phone ring. Strange, right? Because the ringer was set to max volume, which led police to check the guest house lines. And guess what they found? The cord had been cut. Not recently, weeks ago. Clean. Intentional. Almost like someone knew that call would come and didn't want to hear it. Now here's where things get creepy. One of the officers searching the kitchen noticed something in the overhead light fixture, a blinking red dot. It was a hidden camera. Tiny. Sophisticated. Battery-powered. Tucked just above the bulbs. Recording. Detectives removed the device and handed it over to digital forensics. What it revealed would shake even the most hardened cops. The footage from the hidden camera shows Rob and Michelle sitting at the table, talking, calm, not arguing. Then, a noise from the hallway. They both turn. Rob gets up, disappears out of frame. Michelle stays seated. Then she gasps. And then the screen goes black. Intentionally, as if someone cut the recording mid-event. And here's the disturbing part. The camera wasn't installed by Rob or Michelle. It was wireless, external, remote accessible. And the signal was traced to a cloud server registered under a company no one recognized. A shell corporation, owned by someone with deep Hollywood connections. We'll get to that in Chapter 6. But for now, remember this. Someone was watching. Watching before the murders. Which means this wasn't spontaneous. This was surveillance. Control. Preparation. A production. One more detail. On the refrigerator, written in black marker, was a quote. Nick's handwriting. The curtain closes. The audience gasps. The final scene has blood on its hands. That wasn't just a random musing. That was a direct line from Nick's unreleased script, House of Glass. Which tells us two things. 1. He had been planning this. 2. He wanted it to be understood as a narrative. Not a crime. A performance. And in a twisted way, he pulled it off. Because when the police looked at that kitchen, they didn't just see death. They saw direction. Blocking. Framing. Symbolism. This wasn't a double homicide. It was a script brought to life. And Nick? He wasn't just the killer. He was the actor, the writer, the director, and maybe, just maybe, someone else was the executive producer. Because as the detectives reviewed the footage, traced the wire transfers, and examined Nick's final journal pages, they noticed a pattern, a signature. Someone had been feeding Nick not just delusions, but structure, steps, scenes. And the final act wasn't murder. It was revelation. A reveal. The real question is, what truth was Nick trying to expose? Because according to him, his parents weren't who they claimed to be. And what the investigators found next, in a sealed envelope beneath Rob Reiner's desk drawer, hinted at a secret the family had hidden for decades. A secret that could explain everything, or ruin everyone. But the letter found under Rob's desk? It wasn't addressed to his wife, or to Nick. It was addressed to someone who wasn't even in the family at all. But the letter found under Rob's desk? It wasn't addressed to his wife, or to Nick. It was addressed to someone who wasn't even in the family at all. And that someone had been in their lives for years. But let's not rush into that twist just yet. Because before there was a letter, before there were bodies, there was Romy, and she had seen it coming. You might think she was just the daughter, a bystander in the chaos. But Romy Reiner was more than a witness. She was the family's last line of defense, and no one listened. Let's rewind 3 weeks before the murders. Romy shows up at the Brentwood estate unannounced. Not to visit, but to warn. She had just come back from a trip abroad. Some say it was a writer's retreat. Others claim it was more like an escape. Either way, she returned with a strange feeling in her gut. She told a close friend. It felt like something was off. Like the air around my parents was heavier. Like the house was hiding something. And the moment she walked into the guest house to say hello to her brother, she said her heart dropped. Nick didn't greet her, didn't smile, didn't even stand. He just looked at her and said, "It's not safe here. That's all." Then he went back to scribbling something on a yellow legal pad. Romy tried to laugh it off. "What are you writing, a manifesto?" Nick looked up and replied, "Just the final scene." At first, she thought he was being dramatic. Maybe working on a new script. But when she peeked at the page, it wasn't a screenplay. It was a list. Names, dates, locations. Some of the names she recognized, family members, an old therapist, their childhood nanny. Some names she didn't. All of them were crossed out. Except 2. Rob. Michelle. That night, Romy didn't sleep. She stayed up, sat in her childhood bedroom, pacing, rereading old texts from Nick, looking for clues she may have missed. because Nick had always been fragile. But this felt dangerous, obsessive, final. She called her mother the next morning, told her everything, begged her to make Nick see someone, anyone. And Michelle? She dismissed it, gently, lovingly, but still dismissed. He's just processing, honey. He's in a dark phase. We're keeping an eye on him. But they weren't. And Romy knew it. So she did something drastic. She called the police. That's right. 10 days before the murder, Romy Reiner filed a welfare concern report with LAPD. Not on a stranger, on her own brother. She told them, I'm worried he's planning something. He talks about alternate realities, about final scenes. He's obsessed with the idea that our parents are imposters. The officer on the other end of the line didn't take it seriously. They chalked it up to creative family drama. Another Hollywood household on edge. No threats, no weapons, no immediate danger equals no follow-up. Case closed. But Romy wasn't done. She tried something else. She emailed one of her father's oldest friends, a fellow director, someone close to the family who also had experience with crisis situations. Subject line, please help me with Nick. In the body of the email, she wrote, this isn't addiction. This isn't depression. It's something darker. He's convinced we're all lying to him. He said I've been chosen, that someone is funding his purpose. I don't know what that means, but it scares me. She never got a reply, but guess what? That email was found in the inbox of a man who'd been off the grid for months. A man whose name will surface in Chapter 6. But for now, we stay with Romy. For days before the murders, Romy tried again. She confronted Michelle in person. They were alone in the garden, drinking tea. The sun was setting. According to Romy's statement, she pleaded, Mom, he's not writing anymore. He's not healing. He's preparing. Michelle looked at her, eyes tired, and said, if I act like I'm afraid of him, I'm afraid I'll become the enemy in his head. Pause right there. Read that again. If I act like I'm afraid of him, I'm afraid I'll become the enemy in his head. That sentence says everything. Because Michelle wasn't blind. She knew, but she also believed, deeply, that Nick could come back from the edge. She didn't want to betray his trust, didn't want to trigger him, didn't want to become the villain in his twisted narrative. So she stayed silent. And Romy? She walked away, angry, heartbroken, powerless. But she left something behind. An envelope, addressed to Rob. Inside, 3 printed screenshots from Nick's Instagram DMs. Messages he'd sent late at night to someone named at Hidden Director 1. Messages that read, they don't know I know the truth. Final rehearsals are almost over. Payment cleared. I'm ready to reveal everything. At first glance, they looked like nonsense. But with context, they were chilling. And here's the part no one talks about. That envelope was never opened. It was found still sealed in Rob's desk drawer after the murders. Why? Because he never got the chance to read it. Or maybe he saw it and chose not to. That question lingers. 2 days before it all unraveled, Romy made one final effort. She texted Nick, hey, I'm worried about you. Can we talk? He replied instantly, can't. Too much to rehearse. Curtains almost up. Then nothing. So when Romy arrived at the estate that Sunday morning, it wasn't just for brunch. She was going to intervene. She was going to finally confront Nick. She brought a bag of documents, emails, printouts, therapy notes she'd collected over the years. She was going to sit him down, look him in the eye, and beg him to stop whatever he was planning. But she never got the chance. Because when she opened that front door, her parents were already gone. And Nick? He was waiting. The moment police arrived, Romy collapsed on the front lawn. Witnesses say she rocked back and forth, repeating the same phrase. I told them. I told them. I told them. Over and over and over. And when detectives tried to comfort her, she looked one of them dead in the eye and said, this isn't over. He's not alone. She wasn't wrong. Because once Nick was arrested, once his phone was confiscated and his guest house searched, that's when things spiraled. Wire transfers, video files, encrypted chats with burner accounts, and one name, always mentioned, never spoken. Just an initial, just a shadow. Someone who hadn't been seen in public for years. Someone who had quietly disappeared from the industry. Someone who had once told Rob Reiner, one day, you'll regret crossing me. We'll name him soon. But for now, let's pause on Romy. Because her warning wasn't just ignored. It was buried. By her parents. By the system. By the assumption that love is enough. But love isn't always a cure. Sometimes it's a blindfold. And in this case, it was a death sentence. But what no one realized, not until the court documents were unsealed, was that Romy had already begun her own investigation. She'd hired a private investigator. And what that investigator found was a paper trail, a digital breadcrumb path that leads from a hidden shell company to a suspicious trust account, to a name tied to one of Hollywood's darkest scandals. And when we tell you who signed the final payment check to Nick Reiner, you'll understand why Romy's warning wasn't just a cry for help. It was a detonator, and the explosion was coming next. 6 words, quietly muttered in the back of a police cruiser. I was paid to do this. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't even a plea for help. It was matter of fact, like stating the weather, like ordering lunch. I was paid to do this. 6 words that changed everything. 6 words that turned a tragic family murder into a full-blown conspiracy. Because up until that point, detectives had assumed one thing. This was a crime of rage. A son's psychotic break. A mental health collapse with a body count. But now it sounded like a transaction. Let's rewind to the moment it was said. Nick Reiner sat in the back of the cruiser. Hands cuffed. Clothes soaked in blood. Face emotionless. The officer riding in front tried to ask him basic intake questions. Name. Age. Emergency contact. Nick answered, but slowly. Like he was half there. Like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Then, just as they pulled out of the Brentwood driveway, Nick leaned forward and calmly said, "You don't need to look for the weapon. You won't find it." The officer asked, "Why not?" Nick smiled, just slightly, and replied, "Because I was paid to do this." At first, the officer didn't know what to make of it. But it was recorded on dashcam. Audio clear. Date and time stamped. And just like that, the entire tone of the case shifted. Because now we weren't talking about a mental break. We were talking about motive, intention, and worst of all, collusion. If Nick was paid, someone else was involved. Someone who funded it. Someone who wanted Rob and Michelle Reiner dead. But why? And who? When Nick arrived at the station, he was processed like any other suspect. Stripped, cleaned, photographed, swabbed. But during the entire procedure, he kept asking one strange question. Has anyone called the producer yet? The officer asked, "What producer?" Nick didn't explain, just stared blankly and whispered, "He knows what this means." That phrase, "he knows what this means," showed up multiple times during Nick's initial 72-hour hold. In fact, when they brought in a psychiatric evaluator, Nick said something even more bizarre. This wasn't violence. It was the finale. "You don't interrupt a finale." The therapist asked, "Nick, do you know why you're here?" Nick replied, "Because I played my part. Now it's his turn." At this point, authorities weren't just concerned. They were terrified. Because what if this wasn't an isolated incident? What if someone else was about to play their part? Enter the financial task force. The moment Nick mentioned being paid, a secondary investigation began. And what they found shocked even the most seasoned analysts. Nick Reiner had 3 active bank accounts. 2 were joint accounts opened years ago by Rob and Michelle, typical parental safety nets. But the third? It was new. Opened 6 months before the murders. Under a different name. The account name? Glass House Holdings. Sound familiar? It should. Because that was the exact title of Nick's fictional screenplay, House of Glass. This wasn't just a name choice. This was deliberate, symbolic, intentional. And when they traced the source of the deposits, they found 5 separate wires, all under $10,000, carefully placed to avoid federal reporting thresholds. The total? $48,500, just under the IRS red flag line. And each deposit was labeled in the memo line with a single word. Consulting. Consulting for what? That's what investigators wanted to know. Now, here's where things get really disturbing. All 5 deposits were traced to offshore accounts, but the last one, the largest, $18,000, came directly from a Delaware-based LLC. That LLC, registered to a P.O. box. But cross-referencing tax filings revealed something chilling. The company had been dormant for years, until 3 months prior to the murders, and its registered agent was once an executive assistant for a powerful but disgraced Hollywood director. A man who had publicly feuded with Rob Reiner over a documentary project more than a decade ago. Let that marinate. We'll get back to him in Chapter 6. For now, We focus on the confession itself. Because the moment financial investigators brought this information to LAPD, everything changed. Nick was no longer viewed as just a suspect. He was now evidence, a living piece of a bigger puzzle, which meant interrogation had to be handled delicately. On day 3, detectives sat Nick down in a quiet room. 2 chairs, 1 camera, no pressure. The lead investigator asked him gently, "Nick, we're trying to understand. You said you were paid. Who paid you?" Nick tilted his head and replied, "You already know. He's always been behind the curtain." The detective pushed, "Are you saying this person directed you to do what you did?" Nick smiled. "Directed, produced, funded. Call it what you want." Then the detective asked something bold. "Was this your idea?" Nick paused, looked up at the camera, then whispered, "It was his script. I just learned the lines. Now think about the language here. Script, lines, curtain, finale. It's not just obsession with film. It's immersion." Nick wasn't living in reality. He was living in a narrative given to him, piece by piece, until it became his truth, until he could no longer tell the difference. But here's the contradiction that kept the police awake at night. Nick was lucid, articulate, smart, strategic. He wasn't raving. He was performing. Which begs the question, was this whole thing, the confession, the murder, the arrest, all part of someone else's plan? And was Nick just the fall guy? Or worse, was he complicit? After 4 days in custody, Nick made one final statement before requesting a lawyer. He leaned in and said, "There's a reason I didn't run. You were meant to catch me. That's how this ends." His next act starts now. That statement sent a wave of dread through the department. Because if Nick was telling the truth, if this was orchestrated, then the next act was already in motion. Authorities immediately issued a sweep for other potential targets. Romy was placed under protective surveillance. Other family members were contacted. Even Rob's former colleagues were warned. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about murder. This was about message, about legacy, about revenge. But it didn't stop there. Because when they dug into Nick's laptop, they found a video file, labeled simply, offer_accepted.mov, password protected, encrypted, time-stamped 1 week before the murders. We'll unpack that in Chapter 8. But here's what we can confirm. The file includes Nick speaking directly into the camera. And what he says confirms one terrifying fact. He believed this wasn't just a job. It was a sacrifice. He believed he was exposing something, ending something, fulfilling something. And the one person who might understand what that something is the same person who vanished from public view 5 years ago. The man whose voice might be on that final voicemail. The man whose name keeps showing up in shadow. The so-called producer. Because Nick didn't just confess. He opened the first door in a house full of lies. And on the other side of that door was a name the world hadn't heard in years. Until now. Because Nick didn't just confess. He opened the first door in a house full of lies. And on the other side of that door was a name the world hadn't heard in years. Until now. So here we are. Nick Reiner, in custody. 2 parents, brutally murdered. A confession, tied to money, not madness. A motive, still buried beneath layers of coded language, wire transfers, and twisted film metaphors. But as investigators pulled on the threads of Nick's claims, something else began to emerge. A shadow. A presence. Someone lurking behind the curtains of this entire story. Someone powerful. Someone vengeful. And someone with a reason to want Rob and Michelle Reiner gone. So here's the question you've been waiting for. Who would want Rob Reiner, a beloved Hollywood director, progressive activist, and family man, dead? To answer that, we have to go back. Way back. Back to 2008. At the time, Rob Reiner had taken a break from narrative films to pursue something more personal. A documentary. Not just any documentary. One that aimed to expose alleged abuse and exploitation within a certain elite Hollywood circle. A circle that, up until that point, had been largely untouchable. The working title? The Silence Room. Only a handful of people ever saw early footage. It was raw, harrowing, full of testimonials from ex-industry assistants, child actors, and background performers. People who spoke of manipulation, gaslighting, contracts they didn't understand, and mentors who turned into monsters. And at the center of that circle, unnamed but heavily alluded to, was a man we'll call X. X had been a producer on dozens of blockbuster films. Respected, feared, untouchable. His name carried weight. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Lawsuits quietly settled. Interns who disappeared. One assistant who ended up in a psych ward, claiming she was being puppeteered. All of it buried. Until Rob Reiner came knocking. According to emails obtained from Rob's hard drive and confirmed by a former editor who later came forward, X was the real target of the silence room. Rob never said his name on tape, but the footage made it obvious. Subtle audio distortions, slight blurs on photos, but every insider knew who he meant. And then, just like that, the project stopped. Cancelled. Scrubbed. Reiner never released it. Never mentioned it again in interviews. Why? Because 2 weeks after its first private screening, Reiner received a cease and desist from X's legal team. And more importantly, a threat. Not in writing, not by email, but whispered to him at an after-party by a mutual friend. You've made your point. Now let it die, or someone else will. Fast forward to 2010. X disappears from the public eye. No new projects, no press. But behind the scenes, he wasn't gone. He was pivoting, moving money into private shell companies, backing independent creatives, mentoring new talent, always under pseudonyms. And that's where it gets disturbing. Because guess who showed up in one of those talent pipelines? Nick Reiner. Between 2015 and 2017, Nick began working on a new project, a psychological thriller titled The Echo Chamber. It was dark, experimental, paranoid, and it received unexpected funding from an anonymous backer. At first, everyone assumed it was Rob, but financial records now show something else. The production budget, over $300,000, came from a shell company tied to a Bahamas-based trust fund. That trust? One of the 5 connected to X. Coincidence? Not likely, especially when you consider this. Emails recovered from Nick's Gmail, sent under an alias, showed recurring communication with someone named Peter, a known pseudonym used by X in multiple online forums. And in those messages, Peter encouraged Nick to lean deeper into themes of broken illusions, exposing masks, and family as fiction. Sound familiar? Because it should. Those exact phrases were found scribbled in Nick's rebirth journal. So what are we saying here? That X manipulated Nick? That he planted seeds of doubt? Funded his fantasies? Shaped the script that would ultimately become real? Well, yeah, and the evidence is growing. Let's talk about that final voicemail again. The one left an hour before the murders. It came from a blocked number, but voice analysis confirmed a match to a known audio sample of X. The message was short, whispered. You know what you have to do. Curtains up. That's it. And when confronted with the recording, Nick smiled in his cell and said, he always knew how to direct tension. That quote isn't just creepy. It's confirmation. Nick saw X, not as a criminal, but as a mentor, a storyteller. The man who gave him a part in something bigger than himself. Now let's go back to Rob. After canceling the silence room, he never publicly addressed the threats. But friends say he became more cautious, less vocal, more protective of his family. He quietly pulled support from certain charities, declined invites to industry panels, and, this is critical, began drafting a private memoir. A tell-all, not for publication, for insurance. The memoir was never found. But one excerpt survived in an email to Michelle. If anything ever happens to me, they'll say it was mental illness or family drama. But you and I both know this goes deeper. Now you're probably wondering, why wait 15 years to strike? Why now? Well, X had motive. In recent months, Rob had reconnected with a producer who wanted to revive the silence room. Updated, bolder, with names. The project was reportedly already in pre-development. Then Rob and Michelle were murdered. And the project? Vanished. Again. But here's where the twist comes in. Because it's easy to see X as the villain. But what if there's another layer? What if Nick's confession wasn't just about money or manipulation? What if he believed, truly believed, that by killing his parents, he was protecting something, or exposing a truth they had hidden? Because according to the final unredacted page of his journal, he told me they're not my real parents. That the story I've been told is just an act. That blood isn't real. That legacy is a lie. Was X feeding him lies? Or was he revealing something Rob and Michelle never told him? We don't know yet. But DNA tests are underway. And when those results come back, they might blow this case wide open. In the meantime, detectives have formally named X as a person of interest. He hasn't been located. His known properties have been abandoned. His last verified sighting was in Berlin 4 months ago. And since Nick's arrest, he's gone completely dark. No emails, no phone pings, no sightings. Gone. Like a ghost behind the scenes. Watching, waiting, maybe planning Act 2. So let's circle back. Who would want the Reiners dead? A man who felt exposed. A man who once lost a career to the whisper of a documentary. A man who saw Nick not as a patient, but as a weapon of emotional warfare. And Nick? He became the perfect vessel. Fragile, angry, hungry for meaning. All it took was a little push, a little praise, a little cash. And suddenly, the finale was in motion. But the final name written in Michelle's private journal, one she never showed anyone, might tell a very different story. A story that says X wasn't the only puppet master in Nick's life. There was another, someone even closer. And when that person's identity is revealed, the betrayal will burn deeper than any dollar ever could. The voicemail came at 3:18 a.m. Rob was still alive. Michelle was making tea, but the words left in that message sealed their fate. No one was supposed to hear it. Not Romy, not the police, certainly not the world. But when the forensics team extracted Rob Reiner's final voicemails, buried in the digital echo of his iPhone, they uncovered a message that didn't just confirm the darkest fears. It detonated them, because the voice was familiar, too familiar, and it wasn't Nick Reiner. Let's walk through it. Sunday morning, Romy discovers the bodies. Police arrive. Scene is taped off. Evidence is bagged. Among the items seized was Rob's phone, cracked, face down near the kitchen doorway. Detectives initially focused on texts and calls after 9 a.m. But the real bombshell was time-stamped at 3:18 a.m., less than 2 hours before the murders. The message lasted exactly 29 seconds. But in those 29 seconds, someone left a final instruction, clear, direct, and chilling. The voice was male, calm, not rushed, no panic, like he'd rehearsed it. Robert, you've run long enough. You had your chance to make this right. I told you the curtain would close when you missed your cue. It's time for the final scene. Don't fight it. Tell Michelle to sit down. And turn the kettle off. It's almost over. Then a click. No name. No number. Blocked. But the reference to the kettle? That part hit detectives like a slap. Because when they entered the crime scene, the kettle was still on. Steam still rising. Which meant the caller was watching. Let that sink in. He didn't just know what was about to happen. He knew what was happening in real time. That's surveillance. That's coordination. That's power. Now, at first, investigators assumed the voice belonged to the same shadowy Hollywood figure, X, connected to the documentary threats and financial wires. But when they ran the voice through recognition software, the result came back inconclusive. Not because the voice was distorted, because the system flagged 2 potential matches. Yes, 2. One was indeed X, but the second? Someone no one expected. Someone inside the family. Someone still walking free. That person was Rob's former assistant, a man named Caleb Farrow, age 43, quiet, loyal, mysterious. He worked with Rob for over 14 years, handled his schedule, managed press relations, even ghost-wrote portions of Rob's speaking engagements. But 3 years ago, Caleb disappeared from the inner circle. No explanation, no farewell, just gone. Until now. You see, the same voice software that tagged X as a match for the voicemail tagged Caleb with equal probability, which means one of 2 things. Either Caleb and X are connected, or Caleb was mimicking him on purpose. Either option is terrifying, but it gets worse. Because guess what else the detectives found? A second voicemail. This one was buried in Michelle Reiner's phone, left just 3 minutes after the message to Rob. Same voice, different tone, almost gentle. Michelle, you did everything you could. You kept the story hidden longer than anyone expected. You should be proud. But you understand, don't you? There's no more room for legacy lies. Not in this house. Let go. It'll be fast. 20 seconds. And then silence. Michelle never listened to it. She was already gone by the time Romy arrived. But the message sat there, unheard, untouched, until the digital team pulled it out of the cloud cache. And when Romy heard it, she broke. In the police interview room, she wept for 45 minutes straight because she recognized the voice. She didn't say who it was. She wouldn't. All she said was, if he was part of this, then nothing was real. So now the list of suspects is expanding. This isn't just Nick. This isn't just X. This is a network. A web. A production. Let's rewind again, because there's one more twist in these voicemails. In the background, barely audible, a second voice appears. This one is female. She whispers one sentence. 5 words. He doesn't know the truth. Then static. Digital forensics cleaned it. Amplified it. They're still running matches. But one theory? That voice was Michelle. Recorded in real time. Unknowingly. And if that's true, it means she wasn't alone during the call. She was confronted. Meaning the voicemail wasn't a warning. It was a command. A kill switch. Let's talk about patterns for a moment. Because now we have a confession tied to payment. A shell company linked to an infamous Hollywood ghost. Surveillance inside the home. Voicemails with specific, timed instructions. And a voice possibly belonging to Rob's trusted assistant. This isn't just suspicious. It's theatrical. It's layered. It's intentional. Just like a script. And as we mentioned before, Nick's journal repeats one phrase over and over. The director watches until the performance is perfect. So ask yourself, was this whole thing a performance? One designed to send a message. To punish. To expose. To erase. Now what message? That part, we're getting closer.